The U.S. and Huawei have long had a complicated history. We've talked a lot about it on this show. The pressure on Huawei ratcheted up at the end of 2018 when its CFO was arrested. Ever since, the Chinese telecom company has been in the crosshairs of U.S. regulators. Now the company is saying it's considering further legal options after a federal judge dismissed its lawsuit challenging a federal ban of the company. Joining us right now is Andy Purdy. He's the chief security officer at Huawei USA. We've had many conversations over the past year about this, Andy, but it does feel like we are now at an inflection point. And the real question I have more than anything else is about really about the public perception of Huawei and what you think Huawei needs to do, not necessarily what the U.S. government needs to do, but what Huawei needs to do to change that if it is to actually do business, not just here in the United States, but to change the perception in the West.
Well, I think it's two things. We've seen some greater attention on one of those things, which is the impact of this campaign to carpet bomb Huawei out of existence, the impact on America. I saw a tech leader on Tuesday talked about Huawei derangement syndrome, accusing the Trump administration of blocking exports, basically hurting American companies. Nearly 300 American companies want to sell to Huawei. We're talking 40,000 jobs. You talk about in the United States, you talk about a lot of jobs on this program on CNBC generally. But the fact is, I don't know of numbers that large that are impacted. And there's no national security reason. This blocking on the ability of us to export this technology that's already cleared national security review
but Andy,
is crazy. So what we need to do at Huawei is we need to have a transparency initiative. And that's what we need to have the carriers and the operators to call on the equipment suppliers like Huawei, Nokia, Ericsson, for each of us, because it's a shared responsibility in cyberspace. Invite us into the experts. Let's talk about what it is we do to provide assurance, supply chain risk, integrated product development, and in fact, our software engineering processes. Let's get the experts to hear this truth, the facts. Let's talk about where we are and where we need to go.
But Andy, the conundrum, isn't it ultimately that as long as this is a Chinese company that is seen as an arm of the government, and I know you don't believe that it is an arm of the government, but so long as China is China, it seems to me that there's always going to be a skepticism and a worry, if not a cynicism, that if the government were to want to use Huawei in untoward ways, that they could.
And as a number of U.S. government officials said in the last year, it's not really about the company, it's about the country. So China is the issue. But as we've said, we can put in place the kinds of measures that the United Kingdom has decided on, that Germany and the EU and France are deciding on. We can put in place measures where we can prove we're not subject to any undue influence of the China government now or in the future, and that has to do with...
So just so we understand, what is it exactly that you did in the case of the UK?
Well, the UK has government-monitored evaluation of our products. And the UK, for a long time, and more recently in the decision that was announced, they are concerned about the role of the telecom and mobile operators because they run the networks. So they control the equipment and the access. So they require, and they've identified the critical nodes in the UK. They've identified and required diversity of suppliers for each node. They put limits on market share. In fact, they've said that if Huawei is not allowed to participate in the UK communication networks will be less secure. So we can put in place measures to prove we're not accessing data. We can't send data to China that we don't have access to, regardless of what the Chinese government may order us to do.
Andy, there's the national security piece, and then there's a separate piece, which is being a good or bad actor in the world of intellectual property. And obviously, Huawei's reputation, at least over the last several years, has been less of a good actor and more of a bad one in terms of intellectual property. What do you think has changed at the company, if something has changed that might ultimately change that perception?
Well, briefly, the context. An industry where in the last 5 years, Apple has been involved in 596 intellectual property cases. Samsung's been involved in 519. We've been involved in 209. Since 10 years ago, there's been great progress by the industry and by Huawei. We now have 11,000 patents in the United States. We purchase over $1.4 billion in licensing rights to products. We spend $6 billion to companies, 80% of American companies, for our rights to use intellectual property. We've strengthened our global and internal compliance program to help make sure that people do what they're supposed to do.
Well, that's what I was going to ask, Andy, and I don't want to relitigate the history because obviously there's a history, and Becky and you had talked about it. It is littered with examples that are less than attractive, let's just suggest. But what I'm trying to understand is what do you think has changed in the last several years inside the company when it comes to IP compliance and all of that?
Well, I think the strengthened internal compliance and internal accountability is been following the model that the United States uses for strong ethics and compliance programs. And the strengthening of the cross-licensing with various companies in America and others, where everybody is understanding who's using what, and people are going to pay for it. Sometimes it's an equal swap. And so that's a very different kind of thing.
Andy, we got to run, but final question. What's going to happen next, meaning in terms of the permutations with which you see this entire battlefield playing out? What's the next shoe to drop?
Well, I think one of the biggest things is the cabinet meeting set for February 28th. The decision on whether the efforts that the Department of Defense and Treasury came forward with, calling into question the further limitations on the ability of American companies to sell to Huawei. Because those companies need the financial support, they need to be able to do R&D, they need to be able to support the American defense industrial base. So we need to protect America first and foremost. But the lesson of the UK as to what's going to happen in Germany and the European Union and Canada, those are going to be very important steps forward because those countries want to use a fact-based approach.
Okay. Andy, it's always good to see you. We appreciate your time and your perspective. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.